Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 62 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the terrace of a seaside hotel in France. The French windows of two adjoining suites open onto the terrace, the space divided by a line of small trees in tubs. There is an orchestra playing not very far off. A pretty young woman, smartly dressed in traveling clothes, steps out onto the terrace. She leans on the balustrade and regards the view of the lights twinkling on the sea with an ecstatic expression. She is on the first night of her honeymoon. It is, however, a honeymoon that is destined to be short-lived. This is the opening of Noël Coward's classic unromantic comedy, Private Lives, an excoriating portrait of love and marriage among the disaffected elite in the dying days of the Jazz Age. Sybil, the young woman we see on the terrace, has made the mistake of marrying Elliot, who is still in love with his first wife, Amanda, despite the fact that their marriage disintegrated in a fury of fighting and mutual acrimony. In a stroke of terrible mischance, Amanda arrives on honeymoon with her new husband, Victor, at the very same hotel, and in the cruelest of ironies, occupies the very suite next door. Predictably, emotional fireworks ensue, imperiling the two newborn marriages. Private Lives premiered at the newly built Phoenix Theatre in London in 1930, with Noël Coward himself playing the part of Elliot, alongside his favorite female partner, Gertie Lawrence, for whom he had written the role of Amanda. The production was a great success, both in London and on its transfer to Broadway, the critics admiring the play's construction and sparkling wit, but predicting it would not last. One Broadway critic called it an admirable piece of fluff. But last it has, as approaching a century on, a new production at the Donmar Theatre in London sees Rachel Sterling and Stephen Mangan in imperious form as the warring couple, both entertaining and challenging a modern audience. So why has Private Lives endured long after the world it is set in has disappeared? Is there more to this piece of fluff than high style and flippant wit? Well, to help me answer that question, I'm lucky to be able to ask a Coward expert, Oliver Soden, who joins me today via the wonder of Zoom. Oliver is the author of a brand new biography of Noël Coward, the first in nearly 30 years, published just last month. In its 5-star review, The Telegraph described the book as truthful, sympathetic, and thorough. This is the biography that Coward deserves. Oliver is also the author of a biography of the composer Michael Tippett and of Geoffrey, the poet's cat, a semi-fictionalized biography of the cat who belonged to 18th century poet Christopher Smart, which, as unlikely as it sounds, was one of the TLS's books of the year in 2020. Oliver writes on art, music, and literature for the national press and is a frequent speaker and researcher on radio, including on Radio 3's long-running program, Private Passions. Welcome, Oliver. Thanks for joining me to talk about Coward and Private Lives.
My pleasure. It's nice to be here.
My first question is, given that you have spent what I imagine is years immersed in the life and work of Noël Coward for your book, when did you first encounter the work of Noël Coward, and what is it about him or his work that inspired you to devote such a huge part of your life to him?
Well, I first encountered him usefully for this discussion when I was taken at the age of 11 to see Private Lives in the West End in the production with Alan Rickman and Lindsay Duncan by Howard Davies, which I remember very vividly, given it was so long ago and I was so young. And I remember being absolutely transported by the comedy and the violence of it. It was a sort of Christmas treat, as I remember. And I'd seen some of the more famous plays over the years, the Odd Blythe Spirit revival, Hay Fever I'd also seen. But I have to admit that when I signed up to devote all these years of my life to researching him and his work, I wasn't really a great devotee. It had been made aware to me that the estate were looking to commission a new biography, that there was a new archive and so on. And I said yes, because that did seem an irresistible chance, but then did spend the first year or so, not entirely sure whether I'd made the right decision. Probably because I had taken on the view of some of the critics that you read out at the beginning about Coward being the author of admirable pieces of fluff. But then when I actually sat down and forgot everything I thought I knew and read what it is that he put on the page in all its variety and breadth, all the 50 plays and 9 musicals and 650 songs and on and on and on it goes, then I began to realize just how much more there was to Coward than the admirable fluff, and enjoyed the years I spent with him immensely. But it took a bit of time for me to come round to that point of view.
Well, a huge task. I'm full of admiration for
thank you
for your perseverance, as well as the result, of course. I actually also love the fact that you were taken at 11 to Private Lives. It seems quite a precocious Christmas trip.
Well, I fear the 11-year-old might have been quite precocious in himself. But I mean, it comes down to the point, doesn't it, as to what you think of the play and whether it's a sparkling Christmas comedy suitable for an 11-year-old, as that production with Duncan and Rickman, serious as it occasionally was presented as a sort of wonderful comic evening. But then whether 11-year-olds would take to what Rachel Sterling and Stephen Mangan have done with it at the Donmar recently, I'm not so sure, although I thought it was an amazing production that we'll talk about, I'm sure.
Yes. It might have been a bit scary for an 11-year-old, that one. I'm intrigued by the title of your book, though, Masquerade, The Lives of Noël Coward.
Mm-hmm.
So did he have multiple lives, and did he wear masks? What's this title signify?
Yes to both, I suppose, is the short answer. I mean, the lives was the easy bit because I was just so struck by the multiplicity of forms in which he wrote: the songsmith, the lyricist, the playwright, the novelist, the poet, the wartime spy, the theatre director, on and on it goes. I mean, this multiplicity and variety of everything that he did, both on and off the stage. But this question of masks, this question of constant performance and of disguise, and of this character called Noël Coward that he played and invented the whole time, and how as a biographer you navigate that, whether you're interested in the mask itself or whether you're trying to rip the mask off his face and work out what lies beneath, if anything. There's a Max Beerbohm short story, which I mention in the book, about a man who wears a mask, a literal mask, for so long that his face takes on the contours and shape of the mask. And I think there's an argument that sort of happened to Noël Coward in a way, that he spent so long playing this part with the dressing gown and the vowels and the cigarette holder and the voice and so on, that he rather lost sight of what might have lain beneath. But also there's just a question of all the literal masks in his work. There's an early review of Private Lives which talks about Amanda and Elliot as being creatures with masks. What they're presenting to the world, what Coward himself was presenting to the world, why you might need to live in the world in a disguise of some kind, I thought were all very pertinent questions to his life and to his work. So hence Masquerade.
Well, we will get to the question of whether there are masks being worn in this play and what lies beneath. But yes, I mean, from what little I do know about him, of course, he gained such celebrity relatively early so that he was constantly on show and sort of constantly performing.
Yes.
Although inventing himself as well, as you say. And also famously, I guess, he certainly had to mask to some degree his homosexuality, which was illegal for most of his life. So there's that kind of mask, I suppose.
Exactly.
I was going to ask you about where, as well, then, does Private Lives fit into his life and his career as a writer? How did he come to write this play in 1930, and why?
Well, what's extraordinary is that it's the work of a 30-year-old, which you might consider someone at the beginning of their career. But by the time he comes to write it, over 4 flu-ridden days in a hotel in Shanghai when he was on a tour of the Far East, he seems already to have lived several lives. He spent his entire childhood as a child actor on the Edwardian stage with almost no schooling. He spends the early 20s as one of the youngest performed playwrights in the West End, while not yet really being a star. And then at the age of 23, he writes this play called The Vortex about not so coded homosexuality and drug addiction, and it becomes the smash hit of 1924 when he himself is only 24. 1925, he's got 4 plays, including Hay Fever, running simultaneously in the West End. Then he writes a play called Sirocco, which is greeted so badly there's a riot on the first night and it looks as if his career is over. Then there's a review and there's an operetta called Bittersweet, which makes him the highest paid author of Western theatre. I mean, all these things that just roll in year after year, failure, calamity, success.
All before he's 30.
All before he's 30. So already come Private Lives, that tumultuous decade, tumultuous for him, but tumultuous for the world of the roaring 1920s, has come to an end. And Private Lives is sort of an opportunity to parcel up the 20s and cast a light upon it and upon the way that people lived. So already at 30, he is, I almost want to say, slightly jaded, not knowing what's next to achieve. And as I say, touring the Far East with his friend Jeffrey Amherst, who becomes very ill. Noel himself gets stuck in this hotel waiting for his friend to recover. He himself is suffering from flu and depression. And his friend Gertrude Lawrence, with whom he's only worked on one production, London Calling, a review he wrote in 1923, has been badgering him for a play. And an image appears in his mind of Gertrude Lawrence in a white gown sitting on a terrace of a hotel. And Coward was one of those writers, I think, who planned and drafted a great deal, but in his head. So he lets the idea percolate. You know, writing plays for Noël Coward is a very different thing to writing them down. He has this astonishing fluency whereby the play is suddenly there in his head and he's mulling it over and suddenly it can all just pour out of him over 4 days in pencil, by hand. I've seen the manuscript, very startlingly few corrections for this amazingly constructed, almost perfect architecture of a comic play.
I was going to ask you, I can't really believe it. It seems apocryphal to say that he wrote this in 4 days.
I know. And sometimes it is apocryphal. Sometimes that's part of the legend. But the story of Private Lives really does seem to be true because there was no other time in which it could have been written because the schedule of the travels was so particular. But then as I say, I think the drafting that other playwrights do on paper, he simply did in his head. And that speed and fluency was actually quite important to him as a writer. And he didn't know any other way of doing it. And I think when you sit through Private Lives, when you see it, when you listen to it, I think it betrays some of the fluent speed with which it's written. It comes across to me as something that just tumbled out of a brilliant brain somehow. And he sends off the script to Gertrude Lawrence and she telegraphs back saying, you know, nothing wrong that can't be fixed. So no one, least of all the author, is under the impression that here was an immortal comedy that was going to last a century. And Coward himself says, you know, it's perfectly trivial, but will be quite fun for us to do. I'm quite intrigued by that, quite intrigued by a play where even its author didn't notice the depths that would subsequently be found in it.
Yeah, well, we'll come to the question of depths. You're absolutely right, though, about the feeling of speed and fluency. It just flows by. But also interesting about that comparison between the time he was writing, the tail end of the 20s, and the tail end of his 20s, and how those sort of come together.
Yeah.
And that there is a slightly jaded feeling on the part of these characters, which we'll also come to.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, for listeners who don't know the play, or who haven't yet had a chance to see the Donmar production here in London, could you give us a very brief summary of what happens, the plot as such, in this play?
Well, what is interesting is that the plot itself is so neat and simple. You know, one almost can shove it in 2 sentences on the back of the fabled postcard. The theatre critic Susanna Clapp has said of the play, it's astonishing as a piece of machinery. You know, within 45 minutes of the first act, a divorced couple, as you say, honeymooning together, side by side in adjacent suites in a seaside hotel in France, have rediscovered love, left their new spouses without a qualm on the spur of the moment and run off together to a flat in Paris. And that is Act 1. And Act 2 is an almost voyeuristic portrayal of their conversation when they are alone in the Paris flat, during which they are desperately in love with one another, violently in love with one another. But that violence becomes literal. And in rediscovering the love that they felt for one another before they divorced, they also rediscover that that love is inseparable from quarrel and upset and distress and anger. And by the end of Act 2, they are deep in a violent and screaming row and have split up again. There will be listeners who know that wonderful Edward Albee play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which I think owes a great deal to Private Lives. And the structure is the same, what Albee calls the Walpurgisnacht of Act 2, that dark night of the soul, where everything comes out and they're scrapping at one another and wounding one another, but yet they love one another. And then the sun rises, almost as in a perfectly constructed Greek tragedy, odd as the comparison may seem. You know, the sun rises on Act 3. And in the meantime, the new spouses that they have abandoned in the hotel have tracked them down. And then by the end of the play, those new spouses are deep in a violent and screaming row, and Amanda and Elliot tiptoe off together once more at curtain fall, and you realize that this is a play about a couple who can't live with one another, but can't live without one another. And that is the comedy and the tragedy of it. And I think the comedy and the tragedy are inseparable.
That's brilliantly done. Thank you. I love the analogy with Virginia Woolf. We did a podcast on Virginia Woolf, and the ending of that we'll talk about the respective endings of this play and that, perhaps, and what they go through. It's interesting you saying about the machinery and the first act in particular, because the critic Michael Billington also referred to the structural symmetry of Coward's plays. And I think there's certainly symmetry in the structure of Private Lives, and the first act in particular is so beautifully constructed. Tell me a little bit about what that symmetry and that construction consists of in that first act.
What I find fascinating about the script in that first act is that it is full of echoes and reflections, quite literally. You know, the characters are forever seeing reflections of the Duke of Westminster's yacht in the rippling water that they're looking at. And there is reflection and mirror imagery and symmetry in the dialogue, line by line. It's one of Coward's techniques, whereby almost every line is echoed and repeated by the other person. I'm trying to see if I can remember a good example, but, you know, I'm ill. What do you mean ill? Yes, ill. It's like a ping pong game, these rallies of dialogue. Coward's scripts are almost like pieces of music. I think they're almost notated. But there's something quite panic-inducing, actually, about dialogue that never moves forward because it's constantly stuck, it's constantly juddering. And yet the first act is like a sort of oral ballet. It's a series of duets, a series of pas de deux, where different characters come along and say, well, whose yacht is that? You know, so these two couples constantly saying the same lines, and it's just beautifully put together. I don't know if you've ever done Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. There's a great scene in that play where Rosencrantz and Guildenstern have to play a game of questions, whereby any question must only be answered by another question. And that's a game that Coward plays in Private Lives almost all the time. If you note, almost any question in Coward's script is repeated by another question, which is a fascinating technique. It gives the actual sound of the play this constant rising inflection of querying and questioning and trying to find out answers. But unanswered questions are strangely panic-inducing, and these characters are always trying to find answers to things, and yet they never do. So that's a certain verbal technique of reflection and symmetry that I think Coward uses. I'm
now not going to be able to listen or look at Coward again without thinking about this question technique. But you're absolutely right. It also reminded me this repartee of Beatrice and Benedick in Much Ado.
Oh, yes.
And there's a very specific rhetorical device of repeating the line before that keeps that, as you say, verbal tennis going.
And I'm sure that the allusion to Beatrice and Benedick and the so-called merry war and the relationship between an older couple who seem to have known love once but are trying to find a way of grasping back to it, characters who express love through disdain. I wonder you will still be listening, Signor Benedick. Nobody marks you.
Yes.
I mean, that is so Coward-esque. Also, I'm always reminded of Beatrice in Much Ado, where in a party scene with Don Pedro, and she suddenly says, "Nay, sure, my lord, my mother cried when I was born, but then there was a star danced, and under that was I born." And there is such a parallel there with Amanda suddenly admitting that she'd had her heart broken. I'm sure Coward means the allusion. He was actually very learned, even when he pretended not to be.
Well, we're definitely going to again talk about what's underneath the glittering surface of the show. I thought also about the symmetry in this first act. I mean, there's some very simple things about the staging, which is so beautifully done, where they bounce back and forth between the two balconies or terraces and keep missing each other and building the suspense until this horrible payoff moment when Amanda and Elliot see each other. And we know before, there's a dramatic irony, of course, going on. We know before they do that this is going to be catastrophic.
Well, I defy any young playwright to take that scenario and just get the characters where the characters need to be. I mean, on a simple technical level of getting the characters on and off stage at the right time so that they constantly miss each other and then find each other at the end of the act. I mean, that is supremely done. But I also think because Private Lives is such a well-known play, we've rather forgotten just how shocking that first curtain raise of seeing it at the premiere in 1930 must have been, because, you know, just these two balconies on the hotel, two couples restricted to a slice of stage as small as in any play by Samuel Beckett, by the way. I mean, just the kind of visual image of it. And where does it put the audience? Well, actually, it puts the audience quite high up, floating above the sea, because we know they're not on the ground floor. They say they have to go down to dinner. So these balconies are quite high. And it puts us, the audience, in a very strange, rather vertiginous, rather voyeuristic, not entirely realistic place that I think we've all forgotten just how odd it is.
There's also, of course, all these lovely details. Not only in the interchange between each of them is the language repeated, but it's repeated between the couples. So you see the mirroring going on. One couple talks about, where should we go to dinner? Shall we go to the casino? And then the next couple says, shall we go to the casino? And then they have a conversation about sunburn. And all these details suggest things as well about their characters and their relationships.
Yes.
It's establishing in an extraordinarily economical way the matrix of these four characters, their psychological reality to some degree, as well as the themes which run through the play. For example, it doesn't take us long, does it, Oliver, for us to detect that both these new marriages may not be founded on the firmest of footings, even before Elliot and Amanda see each other, right?
Oh, yes. Well, you mentioned the sunburn. Amanda wants to toast herself to a crisp, as was becoming increasingly fashionable in the 1930s. And Elliot's new partner, Sybil, thinks that sunburn is terribly common and wants to be pale, you know, is sticking to the Victorian fashion for pale young women, you know, just that one example where essentially the two worlds are being pitched together of the original couple of Amanda and Elliot, who live for the moment and live for sex and passion and live amorally rather than immorally. And that the new partners are, you know, perhaps the sex life is not of the most glorious. They're good, boring, safe people. And that's what Amanda and Elliot are trying their hand at as a sort of safer way of life than their previous marriage. But we know that that isn't necessarily going to work.
No, exactly. I mean, doesn't it feel like there's a whiff of compromise from the very beginning? Both Sybil and Victor sense this as well, don't they? Because they seem to need to affirm that their new partners love them as much as they do, or is that they loved their previous partners.
Yes.
And the responses from Elliot and Amanda are not completely convincing, I would say, even from the off. And do you get the sense that Sybil and Victor may have scored above their weight class, so to speak, and that Elliot and Amanda have married them somewhat on the rebound?
Oh, surely. Yes. There's a lovely moment in the Donmar Warehouse's production where Victor asks Amanda about when they first met. And usually it's played quite straight, but Rachel Sterling makes it very clear that she can't remember at all, and that it wasn't remotely love at first sight. I think Coward is about finding different ways of living and throwing out convention in the 1920s and the 1930s, in the rebound after the First World War. And that's what Amanda and Elliot are doing. And the safe, sexless, comfortably domestic life that Victor and Sybil offer is one designed for living that they're attempting, but they're not people for whom that can ever work.
Actually, it's interesting. You were saying about question followed by question. I was going to say earlier that partly that contributes perhaps to the sense overall as to how resolved the play is about a view of the world.
Yes.
And it seems very unsettled. It doesn't really come to some single solution to life for any of these people.
Oh, no, I agree.
But it does feel like, you know, Coward's not that sympathetic to the Victor and Sybil characters. They are definitely lesser lights, are they not? And that the options for a safe and stable and smooth life, he doesn't really champion that, does he?
Well, no, he doesn't. He does something infinitely more dangerous, which is, well, the devil gets the best tunes. He shows Amanda and Elliot as violent and destructive and, as I say, amoral, perhaps more than immoral. They believe in very little. They abandon their spouses without a qualm. And yet, of course, they are the couple who are the more interesting, the more thrilling, the more sexy, the more dangerous. And most to the point, the more comic, because I think Coward's view really is that humor and flippancy covers a multitude of sins. And that, one of the great attractions between them is that they make each other laugh.
Yeah.
And that seems to transcend almost any problem in the relationship, that Victor and Sybil are completely without humor, and Amanda and Elliot have it and use it as a weapon, as a defense, as an attack, as a way of life. And that's one of their great attractions, is it not? But how dangerous to write a play where the least moral, most violent couple are the most attractive. I mean, that is surely one of its more dangerous attractions.
Yes. As you say, the laughter is fantastic because the moments when they come back together, whenever there's threats that they're exploding apart, something sends them into that laughter and that brings them back together.
Oh, completely. Laughter and violence are the two major attractions of their relationship. And one of the things that Coward wants to say in this play and in others, I think, is the dangerous conclusion that perhaps it is impossible to combine burning sexual, lustful ardor and domestic stability in the same relationship.
Absolutely. I was going to add sex to your list there about what they have in common.
Yes.
And actually, it's interesting. When Amanda first appears on the terrace, the stage direction describes her as quite exquisite, with a gay face and perfect figure. She is wearing a negligee. I mean, I think that is a stage direction that you wouldn't find in a play text much today, isn't it, Oliver?
Well, it's the big question about there are so many big questions about the play, but about women, or whether, as has been argued, it's actually about gay relationships. As you just said, the gay-faced Amanda. Now, the word gay had been used to mean homosexual, at least in homosexual circles, for some years by then. The word man, a man, is buried in her name. I mean, if you want to go down that sort of code cracking route. And by the way, Sybil is described as completely feminine. So here you could say that you have Elliot not able to find a sex life with the completely feminine, rather silly young woman, and finding the much more masculine attractions of Amanda, the way forward. And he's not able to reconcile that in the world of the 1930s. And yet, I mean, I don't entirely take that view, because I think all Coward is really doing is widening the definition of femininity with Amanda, who, as played by Gertrude Lawrence in the original, he thought she was beautiful and sexy and she would take his breath away. It's a wonderful portrayal of a woman trying and perhaps failing and trying again to find some kind of liberation in the 1930s. Which is a great period of liberation for women. It's when they find the vote, it's when they have the contraceptive pill, it's when they are able to seek divorce on equal footing with men and so on. I think all of that is in the play in all kinds of hidden ways.
Yeah, the characters make a number of comments about the assumed or desired traits of men and women.
Yeah.
But these statements seem to me to be mostly ironic. So I think what you're alluding to with Coward is true, that he's challenging the varietal definitions of gender behavior in a sense. And there's an example when Amanda spouts a cliche to Victor that the woman should always retain a certain amount of alluring feminine mystery for the man, for example. But in the text, I notice both woman and man are framed in italics. So she's actually, I think, signaling some ironic distrust of this kind of stereotyping.
Oh, yes.
And that runs, I think, every time someone mentions this is the way a woman or a man should behave. It's almost like the reverse is implied.
And when one knows biographical facts about Coward and the women who he surrounded himself with, what he called his chosen family, the stage designer of the first production of Private Lives, one of his closest friends, Gladys Calthrop, who walked out like Nora in a doll's house from her conventional married life, who left her child, who wore trousers and had short hair and lived and loved with other women as openly as possible. It's a great convulsive period of recalibration of what is to be expected of women and indeed of men, as played by Noël Coward, who was hardly the epitome of butch masculinity now, was he?
No, exactly. Interesting also about Amanda I mean, clearly she's beautiful, as the stage direction suggests, and she is imperious and glamorous and powerful. But she's also, Eliot says, she's marked for tragedy. She's bound to make a mess of everything.
Yeah.
And as you've also said, it's self-destruction is in their behavior, of course. They can't resist the kind of high-wire hedonist life as opposed to the safe and secure. And she says also that chance rules her life. And of course, the chance is that they meet each other again. And then the gamblers that they are, which is established early on, they want to go to the casino. They are going to take this gamble. But she also has this fantastic speech, doesn't she, about what is normal.
Oh, I think few people are completely normal, really, deep down in their private lives, she says.
Exactly. What I was interested in that is that it hints at, I think, something darker underneath. What I was going to ask you about is that Coward vowed that his work was intended merely to entertain and amuse. But there's much more than that going on, isn't there? When a line like that, which suggests that there's unpredictable dark undercurrents in us, that's all there in this play as well. And you said that to miss his seriousness is to miss his wit, which is a kind of witty inversion, I guess. But I think you're suggesting there is a serious intent in this play. There's more than a talent and intent to amuse, isn't there?
Oh, I think so. Coward mistrusted seriousness, even as his characters do. Be flippant, laugh at everything, says Eliot. And the stage direction for that, by the way, is seriously, which is, quite interesting. Coward mistrusted seriousness even in his own work. But, you just have to think who Amanda and Eliot actually are, by which I mean they are 30. The script is quite insistent on that specific. I mean, they are about 30, and Lawrence was 29 and Coward was 30. It's an interesting point to think of them as that young. They're rarely played that young today, especially when you consider how often they talk about their own death in the play. And they're young, and yet, of course, they're prematurely aged and cynical and seem to have lived a great deal, as Coward had, in their less than 2 decades of adulthood. So they're of Coward's own generation. They've lived through the First World War. They've lived through the Spanish flu. Outside of the walls of their luxury flat, the stock market has already crumbled. The Wall Street crash is only a couple of months old by the time the first production is mounted. They're the first generation who probably didn't believe in God. They don't believe in war. They don't believe in man. What do they believe in? They are, I say rather glibly in the book that this carpe diem spirit, seize the day, is matched only by a belief that the day isn't really worth being seized at all, because they are of a generation pinned between 2 catastrophes, the catastrophe of the First World War and the Spanish flu, and some kind of forthcoming war, which most of their generation believed would happen sooner rather than later, and a future of exhilarating but terrifying modernity, which they talk about with startling frequency. It's amazing to be reminded that in Private Lives, Eliot talks about television and its forthcoming ubiquity, and cosmic atoms and aeroplanes. And, what happens when we're dead? What happens after one of us dies? Come and kiss me, darling, before worms pop in and out of your eye sockets. I mean, these are not lines that you would actually find in Oscar Wilde or some conventional drawing room comedy. Live for the moment because the moment might be numbered.
It's a fascinating challenge, isn't it, to directors and to us, I suppose, in some way, this tone of this play, because it is complex in those ways. It is very funny, of course. And this wit, as we've talked about, is sparkling and dazzling and wonderful, but it's not just harmless, bright wit. There's a real tension in this tone. There's a darker dynamic in Amanda and Eliot's relationship and their sardonic view of the world, which you're also describing, of their age. And if you read the text, and in the Donmar production in particular, I think this is very much to the fore. Their jibes to each other, and for example, Eliot's attacks on Sybil, are truly vicious.
Oh, yes.
And if you strip them of the kind of witty performance gloss, they're pretty nasty. I mean, he says things like, I'd like to cut your head off with a meat axe, or I hope your dinner chokes you, to Sybil. This is on the first night of their honeymoon.
And note the specificity of that, which I think is just genius. Meat axe. Now, if the word meat wasn't there, the line would be very, very different. There's something chilling and specific about meat axe, I think, in that line. As you say, the Donmar production plays it. It stretches this script to its full extent of merriment and violence. The merriment is more merry and the violence is more violent. And I was thrilled by that when I saw it. And at first thought that Michael Longhurst, the director, had somehow reinvented it. And then realized, as I think you say, and have been arguing, that actually he's just showing us what is there on the page.
Yeah, absolutely.
I went back to the script, not having looked at it in a couple of years, and every moment where I had slightly hesitated and thought, God, they've pushed that a bit far, haven't they, is there in the script. You know, he hits her a welt over the face. He grabs her and shakes her like a rat. And the lines in the dialogue are so astonishingly violent. And what the production very daringly aims to show is that, well, the violence is a curious turn-on for them. I mean, there's an astonishing moment where they are going at one another while undressing one another in the production. And he's got his hand around her neck, or he's holding her hands behind her back. And the dangerous line between sex and violence and sexual violence and domestic sexual violence and domestic abuse, I mean, all that is there in the play and brought out fabulously by this new production.
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary how this production, how explicit that is. The violence is explicit in the text, as you say, as well, though. It refers more than once to Elliot hitting Amanda and their previous fights, rolling around, wrestling on the floor. And there's also a comment, Elliot's line, which is very hard to know what to make of this day and age, when he says, certain women should be struck regularly like gongs. And in the context of the way they've interpreted this, there's real physical violence on the stage. In fact, audiences were gasping at what occurs. But the stage directions are essentially there, which establishes that they have this kind of relationship. But what I wanted to ask you is, how did earlier audiences view this? Was it glossed over, performed like slapstick? Because how could you call this a piece of fluff?
We know that Lawrence and Coward went for it. I mean, there's a letter that he sent her saying, I'm paraphrasing, we have to go all out in the violent scenes and we have to go all out in the love scenes. And we know that the safety curtain of the Phoenix Theatre in the first production, which rather ironically was decorated with Titian's The Triumph of Love, used to fall at the end of Act 2, and they were rolling and rolling over one another with, you know, hunks of hair in their hands and so on. And they went all out. Is it as easy as saying, oh, well, the 30s were a different time and they all just took violence against women in their stride and now we're much more enlightened and we're very shocked by it? I don't think it is as simple as that. Yes, attitudes have changed and obviously we are more sensitive to it, but it was shocking in 1930. And that line about women should be struck regularly like gongs was called out in the Sunday Times, I think, as being a bit close to the bone. And other things were shocking in its day as well. The discussion of atheism was said to pass a faint cold wave over the stalls in the first run. Michael Longhurst, the director of this new production at the Donmar, said, you know, you can't in 2022 just play some of these lines for laughs. You can't. It just wouldn't work somehow. I think he's right, but I also think they were dangerous at the time.
Yes, he also said, I heard him on the radio the other day saying that he wanted to ensure that the choreography of the fighting, particularly this physical fighting in Act 2, did not feel fake as much theatrical fighting does.
Yes.
But it's interesting. I was going to ask you, what was Coward's intent then with the inclusion of this violence? Was he being deliberately, seriously provocative, testing boundaries? And if so, why? What is his purpose in including such violence?
Well, of course, it would be nice to say that it's all a great expose of misogynistic domestic violence towards women. Whether it's as simple as that, I think he enjoys, in a rather dangerous way, the comedic architecture of the violence, if that makes sense. That, you know, even in 2022, enlightened as we all are, it would be absurd to suggest that some of these uncomfortable lines aren't funny, even as they are uncomfortable. I think it's to do with his very destructive view of love, which is autobiographical. This view, perhaps, that we destroy the thing we love, that scratch the surface of any relationship or any character. And underneath us all, he seems to say, there is some dark, wounded territory that is just waiting for some kind of provocation to reveal it into the light. Because, you know, what happens at the end of the play, the seemingly upright, decent characters of Victor and Sybil, who until that point have been starchy and rigid and well-behaved, you know, flick even them. And what comes out, but again, this darkness, this violent temperament. And maybe he's cynical enough to think it's there in all of us, were we but theatrical enough not to control it.
I think you're spot on, because it's not a very optimistic portrait of love or marriage. We've already had one acrimonious divorce before the play begins, and in a very short order, we're witness to two more. I think possibly the violence, as you say, is a presentation of the realities, the dark realities that he knows exist, and he slips them in almost under this cloak of wit and flippancy.
Well, there's another play, Blithe Spirit, about the ghost who comes back to haunt her husband, Elvira. Wonderful comic play. And yet you realize that Charles Condamine, the protagonist, once hit Elvira with a billiards cue. That violence is always there in Coward. And I think he presents us with men such as Charles Condamine in Blithe Spirit, particularly Eliot in Private Lives. I think they are sort of interwar rakes, a la Restoration comedy. I think they have a kind of rake's progress through variously tantalizing worlds of temptingly immoral love and debauchery. And occasionally they get their comeuppance. I mean, I think Coward does chart rake's progresses in the post-war world.
It was interesting you saying about the flippancy, because I think you've said this play isn't flippant. Eliot has this moment where it's almost a modus vivendi, isn't it?
Yeah.
Be flippant, laugh at everything. And I wonder, is that Coward's answer to everything? What does this flippancy mean? It's not as simple or as surface as it sounds, is it?
No, not at all. It's the difference, if you'll concede it, between writing a flippant play, which I don't think Private Lives is, and writing a play about flippancy employed as a mask, to go back to that running theme, or as armor against a increasingly meaningless, predatory, unhappy world. That speech goes on. He says, be flippant, laugh at everything. That brings out the acid in their damned sweetness and light. It's the curious attraction of living amorally and living freely, free to love whom you like, where you like, when you like, free not to be faithful, liberated, and all the rest of it, while showing how dangerous and lonely freedom and liberation can actually be, and how hard they are to achieve in any truthful or meaningful way. And another working title for my book was The Cost of Freedom, because I think that's quite interesting where Coward is concerned, that you can't actually achieve freedom without hurting people, which Amanda and Eliot certainly don't manage to do. There's a very good line in one of the plays in Tonight at 8:30, which he wrote in 1936. Nobody can live without loving someone. Nobody can love without leaving someone.
Oh.
And what is that but Private Lives?
Yeah, as you say, this flippancy it's a means of dodging unhappiness in some way, a cover. In fact, Eliot says flippancy might cover a very real embarrassment. So he's conscious, I guess, that it's a modus vivendi, that it's a performance. It's a way not to face honest and dark truths, but also not be restricted by artificial constructs of how to live.
Yes, exactly. The damned shibboleths, they are called in the play, the conventions and morals of a previous generation whose views and decisions proved so calamitous in 1418. And that is a true reflection of how the younger generation tried to live in the 20s, and the bright young things. Laugh because everything is meaningless. But as he says in one of his song lyrics, cocktails and laughter, but what comes after? Nobody knows. Coward can be quite a warning sort of voice, I think. He holds up a mirror and says, yes, this is how we're all being, myself included. We all think that life is so meaningless, that sincerity is pointless and humor is the only answer. But what comes after? What is the cost of this? And Private Lives ends in a wonderfully funny way, as you know, with them tiptoeing off again, and the whole cycle begins again. And it ends with the sort of convention of a comedic play. Yet I think there's a sort of tension between a concession on the playwright's part, on Coward's part, that life and reality does not always conform to the architectural rules of light comedy. It's like the end of a Shakespeare play when Twelfth Night or Measure for Measure seemingly ends in the happy world at the end of a conventional comedy, and yet who is left? What has happened? What is the pain? Or the end of a Mozart opera. It ends in that world, I think.
Yeah, well, we'll come to the ending shortly, but I think you're right. There is discussion even between them, isn't there, Amanda and Eliot, about what comes after, as in what afterlife And I think they just basically think there's nothing and that there's no God, and either of them believe in God or hell. I wanted to ask you then, you've used the word amoral a couple of times. The critic Irving Wardle wrote that for all their authentic glitter and disclaimer of any purpose beyond entertainment, Coward's plays are among the most earnestly moral works to be found anywhere in modern drama. And yet, you wrote, I think, about this play that it exists in a world of sort of moral emptiness. It does feel that way to me, and the way you've been talking about it today absolutely chimes. Does Coward or these characters really have any moral beliefs? Amanda says, I'm so apt to see things the wrong way around, morals, what one should do and what one shouldn't. In other words, she hasn't got a clue. And as you said earlier, they don't have much compunction about destroying Sybil and Victor's happiness or guilt at having done so. They appear to lack faith in anything. Eliot says to Amanda, you have no faith. That's what's wrong with you. Amanda replies, absolutely none. It's almost nihilistic.
Oh, yes, completely. Dear God, what does it all mean? One of them says. Or, how long, O Lord, how long? Which is an astonishing line he puts into Amanda's mouth in the middle of Act 2, which contemporary audiences would have recognized as the line that St. Joan of Arc says as she's being burnt at the stake in the George Bernard Shaw play, which was only 7 years old.
Is it as bleak as that? Is Coward's worldview as bleak as that?
I think Coward's worldview is terribly bleak, actually, and cynical. And Elaine Stritch, the actress, said he was the saddest man she'd ever met. And I think, as was once said of Haydn, the composer whose music is usually ebullient and witty and glorious, that sense that he could have been a great tragedian if so he chose. And I think one gets that with all the great comic playwrights, actually, that tragedy and comedy are somehow the two halves of the same coin, and that Coward just happens to have chosen comedy as the means. I mean, to go back to this point about morality, I mean, you could argue that it is a deeply moral thing to do, to show, as I think Coward does in Private Lives, the cost and expense of living without morals. I don't elide the view of Coward and his characters. I mean, if you like the play less than I do, and if you are entertained by it less than I am, you could say that it's merely a finger-wagging depiction of these naughty, bright young things of the 1920s, and look how they behaved, and look what their lives are like, and look what the cost of all that was, and look who gets hurt, and look how unhappy they are. There is a modicum of truth in that Coward's plays are sort of moral tracts against the times he was living in, and showing that this money, no object, laissez-faire kind of life was not the answer. But whether he has an answer is another question.
While you've been talking, that fascinating combination of laughing despite the terror, it's almost like Beckett. I mean, Beckett is incredibly funny, which is the paradox, right? As Pinter can be as well. So these things, they do go together in a worldview. And in fact, that is the truth of our existence.
It's interesting you mentioned Beckett. I mean, it's Winnie who quotes laughing wild amid severest woe, she says. I mean, what is Private Lives but laughing wild amid severest woe? I think Coward is very Beckett-like in a curious way, even though he detested Beckett. I mean, someone in Endgame says there's nothing funnier than unhappiness. I mean, the problem is that as soon as you start discussing all these highfalutin topics about morality and bleakness and tragedy, you ignore the fact that the play is very, very funny. And I don't wish to do that, because it is, even in the Donmar's production, wonderfully, wonderfully funny. But all farces are funny, and all farces are nightmarish, and all farces hint at the fact that life doesn't resolve itself as farces do.
No, we don't have control. It's a lack of control as well in farce, isn't it? I think.
Also, I think it's worth pointing out that come 1930, by which time the bright young things in the 1920s had begun to stutter towards their end, Howard's warning against that lifestyle was being proved correct, and that the party-going nightclub, sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle of the 20s, and his social set in particular, was coming to grief by 1930. And young actresses that he knew were dying in their 20s and 30s of botched abortions and drug overdoses. And some of the brightest of the bright young things were now drifting from prisons to nursing homes, hooked on drugs. That life without boundaries, come 1930, had very clearly ended in stock market disruption, to say the least of it, and death in some cases, and addiction in others, and dejection and depression, as in Evelyn Waugh's novel Vile Bodies, which is exactly contemporary with Private Lives, which shows the darker, more nightmarish side of the 20s life.
So you started by trying to bring us back to saying this is a very funny play, and yet...
Yeah, and look where I ended up.
I can't believe we actually ended up with Beckett as well, but there we are. I think there's some truth in this.
Yeah.
And possibly leads me to ask you about the ending, because ultimately there's not resolution. I was going to say at the very beginning about the structure of the play. It's a 3-act play. We have the introduction, and then in theory, in the third act, we're supposed to get resolution. What do we think is resolved when we get to the end of this? I mean, a conventional ending might have expected what? That Victor and Sybil get together as well because they've shared their situation. And when they arrive in Paris, maybe they've developed some sympathy there, and they seem similar characters. So you're thinking, okay, they're going to end up with the appropriate match, these couples.
Yeah.
But of course, Coward, in a twist, throws that idea out because they end up, as you've already said, warring and fighting as much as the others to demonstrate that this is possible in all of us. Mm-hmm. But what about the future of Amanda and Elliot? What do we think is resolved or not resolved as we leave the theater for this play?
Well, almost nothing. I mean, it almost goes back to the beginning, doesn't it? A single slice in an endlessly revolving pattern, sort of love, marriage, honeymoon, quarrel, divorce, repeat. Isn't it interesting that having been talking all the way through about Amanda and Elliot as real people with real fears and weaknesses and passions, which they are, don't get me wrong, Coward is a great psychologist. The flip side to that is that this is a comic play and they are characters in a play. And Coward is one of those comic playwrights, almost like Pirandello, where the characters seem half aware that they are always acting on a stage. And I think come the end of Private Lives, something clicks back. And after the dark night of the soul of Act 2, they suddenly become characters in a comic drama once again. I mean, he uses the word puppets of them a lot. And suddenly you don't quite ask what happens to them beyond the end of the play. You just know that they are characters taking part in comic convention. And as I say, there's this sort of concession, this knowledge that life doesn't conform to the rules of high comedy, but Coward will, as at the end of the Mozart opera. It's as if the rules flick back into place. The first production is very interesting to me because the set was not entirely realistic. You know, curtains over doors were painted on as if in a Disney cartoon. So you can go a totally other route from this play and throw out all the psychological analysis I've just tried and say, no, they're characters in a play and it's all absurdist. You know, it's a slightly surreal, very theatrical, highly self-conscious, sort of cartoony play. And certainly by the end, I think that reading is very persuasive somehow.
That's fascinating because there are some absurdist elements, some lines which are just surreal.
Oh, it's a Mad Hatter's Tea Party. I mean, and the word madness is important in this play. They say it a lot. This is madness, sheer madness. It's even more important in other plays by Coward. It's one of his most used words, this notion of love as a sort of Shakespearean mad enchantment. Coward is quite good at Midsummer Night's sex comedies in that way. And as you say, you know, long chunks of the dialogue about shrimps being shot through ear trumpets and the Royal London School of Bisons. I mean, it just descends into, for all the fact that Coward hated absurdist plays by Ionesco or Beckett or early Pinter or early Albee, this is a very proto-absurdist play in chunks of the dialogue completely, yes. There are about 55 animals mentioned in the script, which I find interesting in the hints that love is a sort of bestial animal feeling, but just contributing to this surrealist atmosphere. It's extraordinary.
You've just made me think that, again, back to this tone and the options for interpretation, that with the serious, as I would describe it, at the Donmar, where they are real people and you're seeing real domestic violence and real psychological despair.
Yeah.
Then those sections of the dialogue where they just riff in surreal fashion somehow felt uneasy. It was hard to fit those into that scheme.
The tonal shifts.
Yeah, which it would actually fit more in this highly artificial presentation.
Yeah.
And that brought me to end by going back to the beginning and ask you, why do you think Private Lives has endured so long after the world it is set in has disappeared? Can we still relate to or care about the travails of what I think someone called the careless rich And these, in some respects, you could say cartoon characters, artificial constructs of character.
Yeah.
How is it that this still could be relevant?
Well, I think its endurance is three things. And one is the simple point that we've already mentioned, that architecturally and as a masterpiece of comic dialogue, the play is astonishingly perfect and entertaining and most brilliantly put together, and is an exercise in skill and technique and humor and wit and all those things. And that is always enjoyable and it always works. It's fail-safe. I think the second thing is proved by the fact that we've just spent an hour talking about it and haven't really come to any one conclusion, by which I mean that all the profundities and ambiguities that can be glimpsed through a very specific and seemingly imprisoningly specific script, there are so many things you can do with it. It can be done sincerely and violently. It can be seen as a piece of homosexual theatre in code. It can be seen as a dissection of heterosexual relationships. It can be done as an artificial comedy or a sincere tragicomedy, or. It has so many ways through, which is always the mark of a great play. In the 60s, it was done with them dancing the twist, not the Charleston, and seemed to sum up that age. And that leads me quite nicely onto the third point about relevance, which is that Coward has always been relevant at those convulsive periods in society's history, the 1920s, the 1960s, where a new generation has come along in the shadow of some kind of global catastrophe, the First World War, the Second World War, and against a backdrop of potential destruction, an encroaching nuclear catastrophe in the 60s, and has portrayed a new group of young people throwing out previous moralities and conventions and seeking for an alternative way of life, and failing again and failing better, given we were talking about Beckett. And if that isn't what is happening now, as in the wake of another global pandemic parallel to the one that Coward lived through and that Amanda and Eliot lived through, the young are emerging from that catastrophe and they are fearful of environmental crisis, and they are working out new ways of living, and they are throwing out conventional ideas around love and sex and gender and sexuality, and it's not coming without a fight, without generational clash, without cost.
Yes, I get what we might have in common is the challenges, the unstable political future, the potential climate oblivion are things that could cause despair. But I'm not sure the generation today responds with amorality. In fact, the reverse, I would say.
Yes, we're a very earnest and serious-minded and perhaps slightly humorless age at the moment. So perhaps we're in need of someone sitting us down and saying, be flippant, laugh at everything.
Okay. On that note, I think also, as we spent an hour talking about these real people, real fears, we recognize a psychological reality underneath what might not be as recognizable to us in terms of the surface language of our time.
Well, and Michael Longhurst, the director of the Donmar Warehouse, brings this to play in a production which really heightens the violence. Domestic violence, especially towards women, is not irrelevant, one could say, about this play. It's curiously prophetic in that way about what was once funny now seems horribly relevant.
I think we just, in very general terms, recognize that as individual human beings and in their relationships and their love and how to navigate that there is darkness and despair about how we feel about ourselves and the world and each other. And that's there, running underneath the glittering surface of this play.
Yeah.
Oliver, we've run over time, as I usually do. Thank you so much for this conversation. Before I let you go, one of the features of the podcast is I like to ask my guest if they could recommend another play, either that we might cover in the podcast or some other play that you absolutely love that you could share with our listeners.
Well, it maybe you're already covering it, as a production's just opened at the National Theatre. But I think if a gun were held to my head in an attempt to make me nominate the greatest 20th century playwright, with greatest apologies and respect to Noël Coward, I would probably say Brian Friel, whose work I revere. And his play Dancing at Lunacer is among his best work, of which there is a great deal. A beautiful, mournful, elegiac, tragic, comic play about an Irish family, group of Irish sisters. as seen through the memories of one of their children, now grown. And maybe you could link a discussion of that to this new production, which I've yet to see, but which by all accounts is exquisite. So I would nominate that as a play. If listeners don't know it, they should go and read it, listen to it, see it, because Friel is the master.
I'm so glad you suggested that. I saw the show last night, as it turns out. And it is gorgeous. And Friel is one of my favorites. We've done Faith Healer.
Oh, yes.
Which is an extraordinary piece. And I'm looking for an opportunity to do Dancing at Lunasa.
Oh, good.
So thank you for that suggestion.
I shall listen with interest.
I should say that Private Lives is running at the Donmar Theatre in London until the 27th of May. If you can get a ticket, do go. It is both, as you may have gathered, an entertaining and unsettling production of this dazzling and provocative play. Thank you, Oliver. It's lovely to meet you. A great conversation. Thanks for bringing so much of your knowledge to this episode today.
Oh, thank you. It was an indulgent pleasure for me.
Great. As the curtain falls and Amanda and Elliot slip away to stagger on with their volatile partnership, unable to resist their chemical highs while knowing that they come with the inevitable sordid withdrawal, what hope do they have for a lasting happiness or possibly even just an undramatic life? It doesn't seem likely. Their version of love does not allow for less than fireworks. There is, however, no easy alternative for peace and contentment. We cannot truthfully say that any of us are normal deep down in our private lives. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the play review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theater going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.